Well, today's scripture reading comes from John chapter 5, and we begin in verse 1. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now there is in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. Let's go to verse 5. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. And when Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I am trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." Then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat and walk." At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. The day on which this took place was a Sabbath, and so the Jewish leaders said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat." But he replied, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" So they asked him, "Who is this fellow who told you to pick it up and walk?" The man who was healed had no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. Later, Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, "See, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jewish leaders that it was Jesus who had made him well. God bless the reading of his word. Now, most of you know the story of Joni Eareckson Tada. When she was 18, she misjudged the depth of a lake she was diving into, and she hit the bottom hard, and she broke her spine and was from then on paralyzed from the neck down. In the first few years of her paralysis, she clung to this story we just read from John chapter 5. Just as Jesus miraculously healed this man, Joni wanted and expected to be healed as well. The healing never came. And yet her faith today, her faith in God's loving, sovereign control over her life, is stronger than ever. She's now 76 years old. For 58 years, she has been in a wheelchair with a remarkable testimony, an advocate for disabilities, an inspiration to millions. Now, she wanted to be healed like the man beside Bethesda, and yet she is living in greater victory than this man ever did. Do you know what the word Bethesda means? Some of you know that there is a military hospital, the Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland. But do you know what the word Bethesda means? It's a combination of 2 Hebrew words, Beth, which means home or house, and Hesed, which means grace. And so Bethesda literally means the house of grace. And this passage about Jesus' encounter with this man beside the pool of Bethesda shows us what it means to live in the house of grace. We are to stand faithfully with Jesus, and we're to serve faithfully like Jesus. That's what it means to live in the house of grace, to serve like Jesus and to stand with Jesus. Now, those are the application points, but until we understand the story, we won't really appreciate the application points. So let me go over this story so that you can understand it. The Apostle John tells us about a man who had been disabled for 38 years. Imagine how you would feel if for the majority of your conscious years you were paralyzed, disabled. It's hard enough in our day with physical therapists and mobility aids and accessibility laws and a social safety net. None of that was in existence 2,000 years ago in the land where Jesus was born and conducted his ministry. In biblical days, every day this man would be carried to the pool of Bethesda by a family member or a friend, and there he would be assembled among the other disabled people, and all he could do was hold his hand out and hope for a few coins that charitable people would give him as they passed by. A local legend had developed around this pool. The legend said that whenever the water was stirred, that was an invisible angel stirring up the water with his finger. And the first person who was able to get down into that water after it was stirred would be healed by this angel. Now, the Apostle John, who wrote the Gospel of John, never buys this legend, but he refers to it in this story, and it lets us know how desperate people are for a miracle, for something to change their lives. So I imagine 38 years ago, when this man had first become paralyzed, he watched that water carefully. He saw whenever it was stirred and tried desperately to get down and be the first person to touch that water and receive his healing. But that was 38 years ago. When Jesus finds him, he had long ago given up on this legend and long ago given up on any hope of getting there if the legend was even still to be believed. But by the time we meet him, Jesus says to him, "Do you want to get well?" Now that sounds like an odd question to ask somebody who, having been paralyzed for 38 years and lived in that desperation, who wouldn't want to be healed? And yet Jesus was reaching into his soul, asking about his will, asking about his desire. I think what Jesus saw in this man was a certain hopelessness and self-pity that had descended over his condition. So Jesus told him, "Get up, pick up your mat and walk." And verse 9 says, at once this man was cured. He picked up his mat and he walked. The problem was it was the Sabbath. And in Jewish circles, you were not to do any labor on the Sabbath, including carrying a burden. And so when the Pharisees saw this man carrying a burden, they accosted him about it. Now, let's be a little bit charitable. Let's be a little bit fair to these men. Jerusalem was a big city, and it was unlikely that they knew that this man was somebody who had been paralyzed for 38 years. All they saw was somebody who was violating the Sabbath laws, and so they asked him about it. Why are you violating the Sabbath laws in this way? But then, did you notice how the healed man throws his healer under the bus? The religious leaders ask, "Why are you carrying this mat on the Sabbath?" And the man says, "The man who healed me told me to do this." And they ask him, "Who is this?" And he didn't know at the time. But later on, Jesus comes to him, and he says to him something interesting. He says to him, "Make sure that you stop sinning, because if you don't stop sinning, something worse will happen to you." Well, now this man knows who Jesus is, and he uses his now functioning legs to take himself to the Pharisees, and he turns Jesus in. Now, why did he do it? One of the biggest fears a Jewish person had in the first century was to be cast out of the synagogue, to be cut off from the community. If that happened, you were very much alone. People may not patronize your business quite as much. Your children wouldn't have any friends to play with. If your son or daughter was of marriageable age, it would be harder to find another family who would want to have your son or daughter marry into theirs. It was a tremendous thing to be cut off from the religious community, to be cut off from the synagogue. Now, Jesus warned his followers that this was going to happen to them if they adhered to him, if they believed in him. So he said in John chapter 16 these words, "All this I have told you so that you will not fall away. They will put you out of the synagogue. In fact, the time is coming when anyone who kills you will think they are offering a service to God. They will do such things because they have not known the Father or me. I have told you this so that when the time comes, you will remember that I warned you about them." Now, that was a prediction of what was soon going to become commonplace. But in John chapter 5, near the earlier part of the Gospel of John, it was a hint, it was a foreshadowing that these things were to come. The Apostle John wrote the Gospel of John while all this was happening regularly. And don't you think he especially selected this story to remind people that this was here the earliest part of Jesus' ministry? People are already starting to get in trouble by trying to stand for Jesus. During this man's 38 years of paralysis, it was the charity of his community that kept him alive. And now he recognized that this network, this social support, would go away if he took his stand with Jesus. And so he decided not to take his stand for Jesus. Now, I think that's what's behind the warning Jesus gave this man. Notice in verse 14, Jesus said to him, "See that you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you." Now, what was Jesus saying here? Was Jesus saying that this man had been paralyzed because of some sin, and he would return to his paralysis if he returned to that sin? No. We don't know why this man was paralyzed. The story doesn't tell us why this man was paralyzed. But Jesus does say, if you sin. What did he mean by sin? He meant if you refuse to stand for me, if you refuse to identify yourself as one of my followers, something worse will happen to you. What could possibly be worse than being paralyzed for 38 long years? The Bible tells us something about that in Matthew chapter 10. In Matthew chapter 10, verse 33, Jesus said, "But whoever disowns me before others, I will disown before my Father in heaven." That's a fate worse than 38 years of physical paralysis. So now that's the story in John chapter 5. It's a story about an unlikely healing of an unlikable man. Now, what should we do about this story? How do we apply it to our own lives? This story tells us to serve faithfully like Jesus and to stand faithfully with Jesus. Write those 2 points down on your sermon notes. First, serve faithfully like Jesus. Now, usually when we read this story, we put ourselves in the place of the paralyzed man, because we all know what it's like to, at least spiritually speaking, emotionally speaking, experience paralysis. And then Jesus comes along and heals us. And so we immediately identify ourselves with this paralyzed man. We'll look at that in just a moment. But the Bible tells us that Jesus is our example, that the way to live the Christian life is to look at him, the way he related to people, the way he conducted himself, and to do likewise. And so one of the things we need to do when we look at a story like this is see what Jesus was doing and imitate it. We need to serve faithfully like Jesus. You know, you ask young adults why they want to go into fields like nursing or teaching or the ministry, and they'll say people. I just want to serve people. And then you ask middle-aged people who've gone into nursing and the ministry or teaching what they don't like about their jobs, and what do they say? People. I can't stand people. Why? Because somewhere along the way we realize that people don't always appreciate our service to them. People don't always appreciate what we try to do for them. People can be self-destructive. They can refuse to make something of the chances they've been given. They can be self-absorbed and ungrateful. Not everybody, thankfully. There are those success stories. There are those stories of teachers who get the thank you note, or somebody that comes back 15 years later and says, "I'm in the field I'm in because you influenced me so much." There are those stories, and we appreciate them so much. But some days what makes you want to quit serving people are the people that you're serving. And that's where the example of Jesus can inspire us to keep going. If you think that every story of Jesus' healing ends with a grateful convert falling on his knees before Jesus, you need to think again. And yet he did not dole out his favors to his favorites and ignored those whom he knew would ignore him. He served all. He served without limitation. And in this morning's story, even though Jesus knew this man would betray him, he served him anyway. Do you ever have those moments when you feel like all the things you've done for your family and they never appreciate you? Don't answer out loud, because some of your family are sitting around you. Do you ever have those moments where you feel like I've been teaching and teaching and teaching in school and nobody appreciates what I do? I've been serving and serving and serving in the church and nobody's ever acknowledged it or thanked me for this. Do you ever feel like that? Jesus would say, "Welcome to my world, but serve anyway." What did Jesus do in our story? He served the undeserving. And what Jesus did in this story, he did throughout his earthly ministry, even to the end. One of the last acts that Jesus performed was washing the feet of his disciples. Do you remember this story in John chapter 13? We're told in this account that Jesus washed the feet of his disciples right before their last meal. This was as common as us washing our hands before a meal today. And it was usually the lowliest servant of the household who would be stationed at the door, and when people would come in for dinner, the sandals would be removed, and the mud and the dirt and the dust of the feet would be washed off the feet. And that way the people would be clean as they came into the house, and often would recline at the table instead of sitting at the table. Jesus took this role of the lowliest of the servants, and he washed his disciples' feet. And it was meant to be a symbol of what he was going to do the very next day. What did he do the very next day? He died on a cross as a servant. He died on the cross to wash sin off our souls, as Jesus was washing mud off the feet of his disciples. And so he was giving this symbol of the night before he went to the cross of what he was going to be doing on the cross. I wonder what went through his mind as he knelt down at the feet of Simon Peter, who in just a few hours would deny him. I wonder what he thought as he knelt down before the feet of Judas, who in just a few hours later would betray him. Probably the same thing he thought about you and me when he went to the cross to wash sin off our souls. Jesus served the undeserving. And if we live in his house of grace, we are to serve like Jesus served. This is exactly the opposite way our world thinks about power. Our world thinks that if you are in authority, or in order to stay in authority, what you need to do is serve transactionally. In other words, you do for others something that you hope will, in exchange, they will do for you. And you ignore or punish those who don't return the favor. That's the way power is understood in our world today. But the most powerful being in the universe, Jesus himself, came down, and what did he do? He washed the feet of his disciples. He served people like this lame man whom he knew would end up betraying him. So one thing we learn from today's story is to serve faithfully like Jesus. Sometimes we will serve people who are undeserving of our service. We're to serve them anyway because Jesus did. Here's something else we learned. Write this down. Stand faithfully with Jesus. Serve faithfully like Jesus. Stand faithfully with Jesus. So we identify, or we try to picture ourselves like Jesus and model our lives like Jesus in the first point. But now in the second point, we need to picture ourselves as this man who had been miraculously healed. This man in our story was finally given the power to stand. And then he refused to stand in the only way that really counts. What I mean is, after he was given the miracle of standing physically, he refused to stand spiritually. When he found out the name of the one who had healed him, he used his now working legs to bring that information to Jesus' enemies. Jesus told the man in verse 14, "See, you're well again, stop sinning. Something worse may happen to you." Like I said before, in other words, what he was saying was, you've been given the power to stand physically, so make sure you stand for me spiritually. Don't deny me here on this earth, so I won't have to deny that I ever knew you before my Father in heaven. It's a warning that we all need to hear. Sometimes it will cost you to be a biblically faithful Christian. You try to live by all that Jesus said, every bit of it, not bits and pieces of it, but every bit of it. And there are people who are going to be confused by you. They won't know how to identify you. They'll think you're one of them, and suddenly you do something that doesn't make it seem like you're one of them. Do it anyway. Stand faithfully with everything that Jesus told us to do. We're going to get in trouble from the world because of that from time to time, in the corporate world, in the academic world, in politics, in the arts, even in the seemingly neutral world of sports. We're going to find ourselves occasionally at odds with people we thought were our colleagues when we stand consistently with what Jesus calls on us to stand for. In those times, we need to make sure we're not like the man of our story. Jesus gave this man the power to stand, and then he wasn't willing to stand with Jesus. It wasn't a risk he was willing to take. You know, it's helpful to compare this story in John chapter 5 with another healing story in John chapter 9. In John chapter 5, it was a lame man who was healed. In John chapter 9, it was a blind man who was healed. And there are many similarities between these two stories, and then one striking difference. In both cases, the healings took place on the Sabbath. In both cases, Jewish leadership pressured the healed men to reveal who their healer was. In both cases, at first, the healed men didn't know who had healed them. In both cases, Jesus later on meet with the men that he healed. But that's where the stories diverge. Once they find out who Jesus is, the man in the story in John chapter 5 takes that information to the authorities. The man in John chapter 9 says to Jesus, "Lord, I believe." Now, at the start of the message, I mentioned that Joni Eareckson Tada, in the early years of her paralysis, desperately prayed to be healed like this man beside the pool of Bethesda. All these many years later, among her many books that she has written, one of her latest is a 30-day devotional guide called Beside Bethesda. And in it, she says that she finally got a chance to go to the Holy Land. Many, many years she's been a Christian. She's taught at seminars. She's written a lot of books. She's advocated for the disabled. And finally, as a Christian, she got a chance to go to the Holy Land. And she said it was an awesome experience to, in her wheelchair, be up against that pool of Bethesda where this story takes place. And in this devotional guide, she said that she lifted up a prayer of gratitude in that place. Thank you for the healing you gave me, the deeper healing. Oh God, you were so wise in not giving me a physical healing, because that no has meant yes to a stronger faith in you, a deeper prayer life, and a greater understanding of your word. It has purged sin from my life, forced me to depend on your grace, and increased my compassion for others who hurt. It has stretched my hope. It has given me lively, buoyant trust in you, stirred an excitement about heaven, pushed me to give thanks in times of sorrow. It has increased my faith and helped me to love you more, Jesus. The man in our story was given the power to stand, and he did not stand in the only way that really counts. Joni Eareckson Tada was not given the power to stand when she prayed about that. And for 56 years, she has stood in the only way that really matters. So this story challenges us to serve faithfully like Jesus and to stand faithfully with Jesus. I wonder which of these two is harder for you. The reality is, because of our personality or because of the voices we follow culturally and politically, one of these will be easier than the other. If you kind of lean toward the progressive side culturally and politically, it may really resonate you, this call to serve, even people who don't like you. But this idea of standing with Jesus, that sounds too exclusive. On the other hand, if you lean a little more to the conservative side culturally and politically, taking your stand for Jesus, man, that sounds like a righteous flex. But serving those who aren't going to do anything good for you in return, that kind of sounds a little bit woke. That sounds a little bit like, loser theology to talk like those who are in the very online world. You see, the reality is that where Jesus calls us to is going to be in an uncomfortable place. Wherever we are, we're going to find ourselves aligning in a lot of ways with our friends culturally and politically, and yet they won't quite know what to do with us with some other things. And all we're doing is just consistently following Jesus. We need to recognize then that when it comes to both of these things that Jesus calls us to live out in the house of grace, one is going to come more easily for us than the other, but do them both anyway. Strive and struggle to do the one that comes easily and the one that comes in a more difficult way to you. Thank God, when we're called on to do these things, we're called on to do them in the house of grace. Because the reality is that I don't consistently follow these two application points consistently through my life. You don't either. And so what we need to do is keep striving all under the awareness that it's in the context of grace. It's in the context of Jesus receiving us as his own, dying for our sins to make us holy before God, continuing to pick us up, dust us off, put us on the path once again every time we stumble and fall. We are in the house of grace. Let's thank God for that. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. My Jesus, thank you for serving me at the cross when I didn't deserve it. Now I ask you to help me serve others, even when they don't deserve it, and to take my stand for you, even at times when it will cost me. Thank you for giving me a place in Bethesda, the house of grace, as I try to live these two big challenges out in my life. And I pray for those who need to come join me in this house of grace, to be roommates with me in this house of grace. Help me to do a better job of inviting people into this house and welcoming those who come. It's in your name, Jesus, I pray these things. Amen.